But thirst is not only physical. Human beings experience other kinds of thirst as well. We thirst for meaning. We thirst for belonging. We thirst for forgiveness. We thirst for hope. The readings we hear today are filled with this language of thirst. In the Gospel of John, Jesus arrives at a well in Samaria, tired from his journey. The story begins with something very ordinary. Jesus asks a woman who has come to draw water for a drink. But this simple request quickly becomes something much more important. The woman is surprised that Jesus speaks to her at all. There were boundaries in place that made this type of conversation very unlikely. Jews and Samaritans lived with deep historical tensions and suspicions. There were also social expectations about men speaking publicly with women they did not know. But Jesus crosses these boundaries as if they were not there. He asks for water, and then he talks about something greater, what he calls living water. At first, the woman hears this literally. She imagines a source of water that would keep her from making the daily trip to the well. But Jesus is pointing to something spiritual. He is speaking about the life of God that quenches a deeper thirst within the human heart. And the remarkable thing is how this conversation begins. It begins with, Jesus does not begin with any sort of judgment. He does not begin with a correction. He begins with a simple request and a willingness to speak with someone others might have ignored. And through that conversation, something begins to change. The woman who arrives alone at the well becomes one of the first people in John's gospel to speak openly about who Jesus might be. Later, she returns to her community and tells others what she has experienced. The one who might have been overlooked becomes a witness. Again and again, the story of our faith tells us the same thing. God does not wait for people to become perfect before reaching toward them. Grace arrives first. And that truth matters when we think about thirst. Sometimes our spiritual thirst is obvious to us. We know when we are searching for meaning or direction. But at other times, we try to ignore it. We fill our lives with activity, distraction, or other types of noise. We convince ourselves that we do not need anything beyond what we can provide for ourselves. But the gospel reminds us that human beings were not created to live that way. We were created to receive. Long before this conversation at the well, the people of God knew something about thirst. As they wandered through the wilderness, there were moments when they wondered whether God was truly present with them at all. The land was dry. The future was uncertain. Fear and frustration began to grow. But even there, when the ground seemed barren and hope seemed thin, water appeared in the most unlikely place. Again and again, the story of faith reminds us that God's grace shows up in places where we might not expect it. It can show up at wells, in deserts, in prisons, in places of conflict, and in just plain old ordinary conversations sometimes. The question is not whether the living water of God is present. The question is whether we are willing to recognize our thirst. Lent is a season that invites us to pay attention to that thirst. It is a season when the church slows down just enough to notice what is happening within us. Where are we tired? Where are we searching? Where are we longing for something that the world around us cannot quite provide? The Samaritan woman comes to the well expecting an ordinary moment in an ordinary day. Instead, she encounters someone who sees her fully and speaks to her honestly and offers her something more. That same invitation continues today. That invitation is still happening. Christ still meets people at the wells of ordinary life, in quiet conversations, in moments of honesty, in places where people are searching for hope. Sometimes those encounters happen in ways that cross boundaries we have grown used to. Sometimes they happen when we least expect it. But they begin with a simple recognition. And that recognition is we are thirsty. And if we are willing to acknowledge that thirst, if we are willing to bring it honestly before God, we may discover something surprising. The living water that Christ offers is not reserved for the perfect or the prepared. It is offered to anyone who comes to the well. So the invitation this week is simple. It's simple, but it's not a small invitation. That invitation is pay attention to your thirst. Pay attention to your thirst. Pay attention to the places in your life where something more important is needed, where you are searching for hope, for forgiveness, for belonging, or for meaning. Do not ignore that thirst. Do not try to cover it up with other types of distraction or the noise that is out there in our culture. Bring it honestly before God. Because the good news of the gospel is this: Christ is already waiting at the well. Christ is already waiting at the well for each and every one of us. Waiting to meet us in the ordinary places in our lives. Waiting to speak words of grace that we may not expect. Waiting to offer the living water that our souls truly need. And when that living water begins to flow, it does not remain contained. That living water flows out over and through us to other people. It becomes a spring of life. It is renewing us. It is restoring us and flowing outward into the world around us. This is the grace of God. This is the grace of God, the living water. And that is a grace that crosses boundaries. A grace that meets us before we are ready. A grace that satisfies the thirst of the human heart. So come to the well. Come to the well. And come honestly, and come thirsty. And at that well, receive the living water that Jesus can give. Amen.